The yard was already tense. Boots scraping concrete. Soldiers shouting orders like they were still on base. That's when the new inmate was marched in. No chains, no struggle, just a calm face and eyes that didn't drop. The soldiers noticed immediately. "Look at him," one laughed. "Still standing straight like he's special." Another stepped closer and shoved him in the chest, hard. "On your knees," he barked. "This isn't your unit anymore." The new inmate didn't move. That's when they decided to make an example out of him. A kick behind the knee, a fist to the ribs, laughter from the others as he dropped to one knee on the concrete. "See?" one soldier sneered. "Even prisoners learn fast." The man slowly looked up, not defiant, not angry, measured. Then, without warning, he stood. One step forward, a sudden grip, a precise twist of the arm. Bone popped. The soldier screamed and collapsed, his body hitting the ground before his mind caught up. Silence. No one laughed now. The new inmate released him and took a step back, breathing steady. "You're holding your elbow wrong," he said quietly. "If you move it again, it'll never work." No one knew it yet, but the man they'd just tried to break had spent years teaching Marines how to end fights in seconds. And what he did next made every soldier in that yard realize they weren't in control anymore. Stay with me until the end, because what happens after this moment changed the balance of power inside that prison forever. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Eastwood Military Correctional Facility sat like a concrete fortress in the Nevada desert, its walls cutting harsh lines against the endless sand. Built in the 1970s, it housed the worst of the worst, military personnel who had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Murder, treason, assault on superior officers, the kind of crimes that stripped away rank and honor, leaving only numbers and orange jumpsuits. The facility operated under a twisted hierarchy that had nothing to do with military protocol and everything to do with survival. Former soldiers, Marines, airmen, and sailors found themselves grouped not by service branch, but by something far more primitive. Who was strongest? Who was most dangerous? Who could command respect through fear? At the top of this brutal food chain stood a group that called themselves the Rising Sun Brotherhood. They weren't officially recognized by any prison authority, but their influence spread through every cell block, every work detail, every moment when guards weren't watching. Led by former Army Sergeant Kenji Nakamura, they had transformed military discipline into something darker. Nakamura had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before a court-martial for executing captured insurgents ended his career and landed him 25 years behind bars. His followers were cut from similar cloth, men who had taken their training and twisted it into instruments of control and intimidation. They wore their dishonor like badges, convinced that their time in combat zones gave them authority over anyone who hadn't seen the same hell. The Brotherhood controlled contraband flow, decided which inmates got protection and which became targets, and maintained order through calculated violence that reminded everyone exactly who ran things when the guards' backs were turned. They had turned military precision into a weapon against their fellow prisoners. Marcus Williams was 42 years old when the transport van pulled through Eastwood's gates. 6 feet tall with graying temples and hands that spoke of decades spent in disciplined training. He moved with the fluid economy of motion that marked career military, but something in his bearing suggested depths that went beyond standard service. The intake process was designed to strip away identity, to reduce every new arrival to nothing more than a number and a cell assignment. But Marcus weathered it with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout his court-martial, conviction, and sentencing. The guards processed him with bureaucratic efficiency, checking boxes and filling out forms without really seeing the man in front of them. Inmate number 74928, convicted of assault on a superior officer, sentenced to 8 years. Just another soldier who had lost control and thrown away his career in a moment of rage. The paperwork told a simple story, but paperwork rarely captured the whole truth. Marcus had spent 18 years as a Marine, rising through the ranks not through politics or connections, but through competence and the respect of the men he led. His specialty wasn't widely advertised in his service record, buried under classifications and need-to-know restrictions. He was an instructor at the Marine Corps Martial Arts Program, one of the few men tasked with teaching the deadliest techniques to the Corps' elite units. Hand-to-hand combat, close-quarters battle, how to disable an enemy in seconds, using nothing but knowledge of human anatomy and years of refined technique. Marcus had trained reconnaissance Marines, force recon operators, and special operations personnel in the art of ending fights before they began. His students called him Professor, a title that spoke to both his expertise and his ability to break down complex combat principles into teachable moments. The incident that brought him to Eastwood had been building for months. A commanding officer who confused rank with character, who used his position to cover up misconduct and silence anyone who threatened to expose the truth. Marcus had tried working through proper channels, following protocol, believing that the system would eventually correct itself. When those efforts failed, and more good Marines paid the price for one man's corruption, Marcus made a choice that cost him everything. One confrontation, one moment when 18 years of training took over, and a superior officer found himself unconscious on his office floor with injuries that would require months of recovery. The court-martial was swift and decisive. The Corps couldn't tolerate assault on a commanding officer, regardless of the circumstances that led to it. Now Marcus found himself in a place where military justice had deposited him alongside men who had committed far worse crimes. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his career training Marines to be warriors, and now he was surrounded by warriors who had forgotten what they were supposed to fight for. His first night in general population passed without incident. Marcus kept to himself, observing the social dynamics that governed life inside Eastwood's walls. He recognized the patterns from his military experience, how groups formed, how leadership emerged, how power was consolidated and maintained. The faces were different, but the underlying human nature remained constant. The Rising Sun Brotherhood controlled Cell Block C, where Marcus had been assigned. Their influence was subtle but pervasive, felt in the way conversations stopped when certain inmates walked by, in the way commissary items seemed to flow toward specific tables, in the careful distance other prisoners maintained from anyone who carried themselves with the wrong kind of confidence. Nakamura's crew had noticed the new arrival immediately. Former Marines were always worth watching, especially ones who moved with the controlled precision that marked advanced training. They began planning their approach before Marcus had finished unpacking his few belongings, deciding how best to establish dominance over someone who might pose a future challenge to their authority. The morning sun painted harsh shadows across the recreation yard as inmates filed out for their daily exercise period. Concrete stretched in every direction, broken only by a few basketball hoops and weight stations that had seen better decades. Guard towers overlooked the space from strategic positions, but the guards inside were more interested in preventing escapes than stopping the casual violence that maintained prison hierarchy. Marcus walked steadily toward an empty section of the yard, intending to use the time for calisthenics and meditation. The routine had sustained him through deployments, training cycles, and the long months of legal proceedings that had brought him here. Maintaining discipline was how he stayed centered, how he kept the part of himself that mattered intact despite the circumstances. That's when Nakamura decided to make his move. The former sergeant had been watching Marcus since his arrival, noting the way he carried himself, the respect he showed for routine, the quiet confidence that suggested someone accustomed to command. All of it needed to be broken down, rebuilt according to the rules that governed life inside these walls. Walls. The silence stretched like a taut wire across the recreation yard. Every conversation had stopped. Every movement had frozen. The only sound was the soft groaning of the soldier clutching his destroyed elbow against the concrete. Nakamura stepped forward slowly, his eyes locked on Marcus with the kind of predatory focus that had made him effective in combat zones. This wasn't going according to plan. New inmates were supposed to break immediately, to understand their place in the hierarchy before they had time to think about resistance. This man had just shattered that expectation with surgical precision. "You made a mistake," Nakamura said, his voice carrying across the yard with quiet menace. "A big one." Marcus remained perfectly still, his breathing controlled, his stance balanced. He had assessed the situation the moment he entered the yard, cataloging potential threats, escape routes, and tactical advantages. Military training never really left you. It just waited for the moment when survival demanded its return. "I don't think so," Marcus replied calmly. "Your man attacked me. I defended myself. That's all." The other members of the Rising Sun Brotherhood began moving, spreading out in a loose semicircle that would prevent Marcus from reaching the yard's exits. Their movements were coordinated, practiced, the result of months of working together to control situations exactly like this one. But their coordination was built on intimidation and overwhelming numbers, not on the kind of tactical precision that Marcus had spent years perfecting. Nakamura's lieutenant, a wiry former Navy SEAL named Thompson, cracked his knuckles as he positioned himself to Marcus's left. "You hear that, Kenji? New Fish thinks he can just walk in here and disrespect the Brotherhood, thinks his Marine training makes him special." "Every Marine thinks they're special," added Rivera, a former Army Ranger whose court-martial had involved the deaths of 3 civilians in Iraq. Until they learn better. Marcus watched them move with the detached awareness of someone who had faced worse odds in places where the stakes were life and death. These men were dangerous, trained killers who had perverted their military discipline into something twisted and self-serving. But they were also predictable, operating from a playbook that prioritized psychological intimidation over tactical efficiency. The guard towers overlooked the scene with bureaucratic indifference. The guards inside could see what was developing, but intervention would require paperwork, incident reports, and explanations to supervisors who preferred problems that solved themselves. As long as no one died in plain sight, the unofficial policy was to let the inmates sort out their own disputes. "Here's how this works," Nakamura continued, stepping closer with each word. "You apologize to Rodriguez here. You get on your knees and you beg his forgiveness for breaking his arm. Then, maybe we let you walk away with just a beating instead of something permanent." Rodriguez was still writhing on the concrete, his face pale with shock and pain. The compound fracture in his elbow would require surgery, months of rehabilitation, and would likely never heal properly. Marcus had applied the technique with restraint, but even controlled applications of Marine Corps combat training could inflict devastating damage. "I'm not apologizing for defending myself," Marcus said quietly. "And I'm not getting on my knees for anyone." The words carried across the yard like a declaration of war. Other inmates who had been pretending not to watch began backing away, recognizing that whatever happened next would be brutal and decisive. Some pulled out improvised cameras, knowing that footage of this confrontation would be worth serious currency in the prison's underground economy. Thompson moved first, lunging forward with a knife made from a sharpened toothbrush handle. His attack was fast, aggressive, aimed at Marcus's ribs with the kind of precision that suggested extensive combat experience. But Marcus had trained thousands of Marines in knife defense, had faced similar attacks in controlled environments and real combat situations. Marcus stepped inside the attack, his left hand deflecting Thompson's wrist, while his right elbow drove upward into the man's jaw. The impact was precise, calculated, designed to disrupt Thompson's balance without causing permanent damage. Thompson stumbled backward, the improvised weapon clattering across the concrete as blood streamed from his split lip. Rivera attacked from the opposite side, swinging a weighted sock filled with batteries in a wide arc toward Marcus's head. The weapon would have crushed a normal man's skull, but Marcus ducked under the swing and drove his knee upward into Rivera's solar plexus. The former ranger doubled over, gasping, as the makeshift weapon fell from his nerveless fingers. Two more Brotherhood members rushed in simultaneously, trying to overwhelm Marcus through coordinated assault. But coordination required communication, timing, and trust in your partner's abilities. These men had the raw skills, but lacked the refined teamwork that came from legitimate military units operating under proper leadership. Marcus shifted his weight and pivoted, using one attacker's momentum to send him crashing into his partner. Both men went down in a tangle of limbs and curses, struggling to regain their footing on the unforgiving concrete. The yard had become a tactical puzzle, and Marcus was solving it with methodical precision. Nakamura watched his crew being systematically dismantled by a single opponent and felt something he hadn't experienced since his court-martial: uncertainty. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Brotherhood's reputation was built on overwhelming force applied against isolated targets. They weren't prepared for someone who could turn their own aggression against them. "Enough!" Nakamura snarled, pulling a real knife from his waistband. Not a prison-made shank, but an actual military combat blade that had somehow made its way past security. "I'll handle this myself." The blade glinted in the harsh Nevada sunlight as Nakamura advanced with the careful steps of someone who knew how to use edged weapons effectively. His grip was professional, his stance balanced, his approach methodical. This wasn't the wild swinging of an amateur, but the controlled aggression of someone who had killed with knives before. Marcus assessed the new threat with clinical detachment, a trained opponent with a quality weapon, fighting on terrain that favored neither attacker nor defender. The kind of scenario they used to simulate in advanced combat training, except now the consequences were real and immediate. "You made this personal," Nakamura said, as he closed the distance between them. "Could have just followed the rules. Could have kept your head down and done your time. Instead, you had to be a hero." "I'm not trying to be a hero," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the deadly blade weaving through the air between them. "I'm just trying to survive." The first knife thrust came fast and low, angled upward toward Marcus's abdomen. Nakamura's technique was textbook perfect, the kind of attack that would have been lethal against an unprepared opponent. But Marcus had spent years training Marines to defend against exactly this kind of assault. He sidestepped the blade and grabbed Nakamura's wrist, applying pressure to the nerve clusters that controlled grip strength. The knife wavered in Nakamura's hand as feeling began to leave his fingers, but the former sergeant was tough enough to maintain his hold despite the pain shooting up his arm. Nakamura spun with the grab, trying to break free while bringing the knife around in a backhand slash that would have opened Marcus's throat. But Marcus was already moving, releasing the wrist grab and dropping low to sweep Nakamura's legs. The former sergeant stumbled but didn't fall, his combat experience keeping him upright through sheer determination. The fight continued with deadly precision, each man testing the other's skills and limitations. Nakamura had the advantage of a weapon and the desperate fury of someone fighting to maintain his position in the prison hierarchy. Marcus had superior technique and the calm focus that came from years of training under pressure. Around them, the yard had become an amphitheater of violence. Inmates pressed against the fence lines, shouting encouragement and placing bets on the outcome. Guards in the towers had finally taken notice but seemed content to let the situation play out as long as it remained contained to the two primary combatants. What happened next would determine more than just who won a single fight. The balance of power inside Eastwood was shifting, and everyone watching knew that the outcome would reshape the unwritten rules that governed their daily existence. The knife cut through empty air as Marcus twisted away from Nakamura's desperate thrust. Years of teaching Marines how to disarm armed opponents had prepared him for exactly this moment. Nakamura was skilled, dangerous, but he was fighting with emotion instead of discipline. That made him predictable. Marcus caught Nakamura's wrist mid-strike and applied a joint lock that sent lightning bolts of pain shooting up the former sergeant's arm. The knife clattered to the concrete as Nakamura's fingers went numb. But the Brotherhood leader wasn't finished. He threw a wild haymaker with his free hand, putting everything behind the punch. Marcus ducked under the swing and drove his shoulder into Nakamura's midsection, lifting him off his feet before slamming him down onto the unforgiving concrete. The impact drove the air from Nakamura's lungs with a sound like a punctured tire. He lay gasping, trying to force oxygen back into his body while Marcus stood over him. "It's over," Marcus said quietly. "Stay down." But Nakamura's pride wouldn't let him quit. The Brotherhood's reputation depended on his ability to dominate anyone who challenged their authority. Losing to the new inmate would destroy everything he had built inside these walls. He rolled to his side and grabbed for the fallen knife, his fingers closing around the handle with desperate determination. Marcus saw the movement and reacted with the fluid precision of someone who had spent decades perfecting combat techniques. His foot came down on Nakamura's wrist with controlled force, pinning the knife hand to the concrete. The sound of small bones grinding against asphalt echoed across the suddenly silent yard. Nakamura screamed and released the weapon. Marcus kicked it away, sending the blade skittering across the concrete until it disappeared under a pile of exercise equipment. Then he stepped back, giving the defeated leader space to surrender with whatever dignity remained. "This doesn't end here," Nakamura wheezed, struggling to sit up while cradling his injured wrist. "You think you won something? You just painted a target on your back that will never disappear." Marcus looked around the yard at the faces staring back at him. Some showed fear, others respect. A few displayed the calculating expressions of men reassessing power structures and allegiances. The Brotherhood's remaining members were helping their injured comrades to their feet, their eyes filled with humiliation and rage. "Maybe," Marcus replied calmly, "but right now, I'm still standing." The guards finally decided to intervene, flooding into the yard with riot gear and shouted commands. They separated the combatants, called for medical attention, and began the paperwork that would document another violent incident at Eastwood. But the real damage had already been done. The aura of invincibility that surrounded the Rising Sun Brotherhood had been shattered in front of hundreds of witnesses. As guards escorted Marcus toward solitary confinement, inmates pressed against the fence lines to get a better look at the man who had single-handedly dismantled the prison's most feared gang. Whispers followed in his wake, stories already growing in the telling. By evening, every cell block would know that the new Marine had taken down 5 Brotherhood members without breaking a sweat. Solitary was a concrete box designed to break men's spirits through isolation and sensory deprivation. 8 feet by 10 feet of gray walls, a steel toilet, and a narrow bunk that felt more like a shelf than a bed. Most inmates emerged from Solitary changed, their defiance replaced by hollow-eyed compliance. Marcus used the time differently. Without distractions, he could focus completely on meditation and mental training exercises he had learned during his years as an instructor. He practiced combat scenarios in his mind, visualizing techniques and responses until they became automatic. The silence that drove other men insane became a tool for sharpening his focus. 3 days later, when the cell door opened to release him back into general population, Marcus walked out with the same calm dignity he had maintained since arriving at Eastwood. The guards watched him carefully, expecting signs of the psychological damage that Solitary usually inflicted. Instead, they saw a man who seemed more centered, more dangerous than before. Word of his release spread through the prison like wildfire. Inmates gathered in common areas to catch glimpses of the Marine who had humiliated the Brotherhood. Some nodded respectfully as he passed. Others quickly looked away, not wanting to draw attention from either him or the enemies he had made. The cafeteria fell silent when Marcus entered for his first meal back in general population. Every table, every conversation, every movement stopped as hundreds of eyes tracked his progress toward the serving line. The Brotherhood members present watched with barely controlled fury, their hands clenched into fists, their bodies tense with unrealized violence. Marcus took his tray and surveyed the dining hall with tactical awareness. The Brotherhood controlled several tables near the center of the room, their territory marked by subtle signals and careful spacing. Other gangs had claimed their own sections, creating invisible boundaries that divided the space into competing kingdoms. The unclaimed tables around the edges were where the weak and unaffiliated sat, hoping to avoid notice from any of the predators who ruled through fear. He chose a table in neutral territory, close enough to the Brotherhood section to demonstrate that he wouldn't be intimidated, but far enough away to avoid unnecessary provocation. As he sat down with his meal, conversations gradually resumed around the cafeteria, but the tension remained thick enough to cut with a knife. Thompson approached first, his jaw still swollen from their encounter in the yard. The former Navy SEAL moved with exaggerated casualness, trying to project confidence despite the visible evidence of his defeat. Behind him came two other Brotherhood members, men Marcus hadn't fought, but who carried themselves with the careful aggression of predators testing potential prey. "Enjoying your meal, Marine?" Thompson asked, his voice carrying just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Hope you're savoring it. Might be your last." Marcus continued eating without looking up. Years of dealing with aggressive personalities had taught him that most threats were empty posturing, designed to intimidate rather than inform. Real danger rarely announced itself with dramatic speeches. "Heard you spent some time in the hole," Thompson continued, sliding uninvited into the seat across from Marcus. 3 days of silence must have given you time to think about your situation here, about how things really work. "I thought about a lot of things," Marcus replied quietly, finally meeting Thompson's eyes, "including how easy it would be to finish what we started in the yard." The threat was delivered with such calm certainty that Thompson actually leaned back in his chair. Around them, other inmates had stopped pretending not to listen. The confrontation between the Marine and the Brotherhood was becoming the most important conversation in the cafeteria. Thompson's backup shifted nervously, their hands moving toward concealed weapons. But something in Marcus's demeanor suggested that any escalation would end badly for everyone involved. The Marine's stillness wasn't passive. It was the coiled tension of a predator deciding whether prey was worth the energy to hunt. "You're outnumbered," Thompson said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Nakamura's got friends in every corner of this place. Guards on payroll, connections you can't imagine. Numbers don't matter if you can't coordinate," Marcus observed, taking another bite of his meal. "And corruption just means your friends will abandon you the moment it becomes inconvenient to help." The cafeteria had become a theater where hundreds of inmates watched a drama that would determine the future balance of power inside Eastwood. Thompson realized that backing down now would complete the Brotherhood's humiliation, but pressing forward might result in another devastating defeat in front of witnesses. Before he could decide on a course of action, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "Thompson, get away from that table, now!" Everyone turned to see Warden Collins standing in the cafeteria entrance, flanked by 4 guards in full riot gear. Collins was a career corrections officer who had run Eastwood for over a decade through a combination of strict enforcement and strategic tolerance for inmate self-governance. His presence in the dining hall meant something significant was about to happen. Thompson and his backup retreated to their own territory, leaving Marcus alone at his table as the warden approached. Collins was in his 50s, gray-haired and weathered, with the kind of steady gaze that came from years of managing violent men in confined spaces. He had seen every kind of inmate pass through these walls, but something about the Marine intrigued him. "Williams," Collins said, stopping beside Marcus's table. "Interesting first week you've had here." "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, setting down his fork and giving the warden his full attention. Heard you used to be an instructor. Combat training. Marine Corps martial arts program. 18 years. Collins nodded slowly, processing this information. That explains a few things. Also explains why certain people in here are so interested in making your life difficult. Around them, the cafeteria had gone completely silent. Conversations with the warden were rare and usually significant. Inmates strained to hear every word, knowing that whatever was discussed might affect the entire prison's power structure. I'm not looking for trouble, Marcus said honestly. Just trying to do my time and get out. I believe that, Collins replied. But trouble seems to be finding you anyway. And frankly, that might not be such a bad thing. The warden's words sent ripples of confusion through the watching inmates. Eastwood operated on the principle that any disruption to established order was dangerous, requiring immediate suppression. For Collins to suggest that Marcus's conflict with the Brotherhood might be beneficial was unprecedented. The Rising Sun Brotherhood has been a problem for me for years, Collins continued, his voice carrying clearly across the silent dining hall. They maintain just enough control to keep other gangs from causing major incidents, but their methods are becoming increasingly brutal. Having someone around who can check their power might restore some balance to this place. Marcus understood the implications immediately. The warden was offering unofficial protection in exchange for serving as a counterweight to the Brotherhood's influence. It was a dangerous proposition that would make him a permanent target, but it also provided opportunities that didn't exist for ordinary inmates. What exactly are you suggesting? Marcus asked carefully. I'm suggesting that a man with your background might be valuable in maintaining order around here. Not as a guard, not as an informant, but as someone who can remind certain people that their power has limits. The offer hung in the air between them like a challenge. Marcus could feel the weight of hundreds of stares, could sense the calculations being made by gang leaders throughout the cafeteria. Accepting Collins's proposal would make him a player in Eastwood's complex political landscape, but it would also paint him as a target for every group that benefited from the current power structure. Before Marcus could respond, the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in seconds later, casting the cafeteria in hellish red shadows as alarms began blaring throughout the facility. In the chaos that followed, Marcus heard Collins curse under his breath and saw guards rushing toward the exits with weapons drawn. Someone had planned this moment perfectly, using the distraction of the warden's visit to launch whatever operation they had been preparing. As inmates began shouting and moving in the dim light, Marcus realized that his war with the Brotherhood was about to enter a much more dangerous phase. The emergency lighting bathed everything in blood-red shadows as chaos erupted throughout the cafeteria. Inmates scattered in every direction, some diving under tables, others rushing toward exits that guards were already sealing. The blaring alarms made communication impossible, turning the dining hall into a maze of confusion and panic. Marcus remained seated, his training kicking in as he assessed the situation with tactical clarity. The timing wasn't coincidental. Someone had orchestrated this blackout to coincide with the warden's visit, creating maximum chaos when authority figures were most vulnerable. Through the dim red glow, he could see shapes moving with purpose while others stumbled blindly. Collins grabbed his radio, shouting orders that were barely audible over the sirens. His guards formed a protective circle around him, but Marcus could see the fear in their eyes. They were trained for riots and individual violence, not coordinated attacks in near-total darkness. Whatever was happening had caught them completely off guard. That's when Marcus spotted the real threat. 3 figures moving through the chaos with military precision, their paths converging on the warden's position. They weren't panicking like the other inmates. They were hunting. Each one carried something metallic that glinted in the emergency lighting. Marcus moved without hesitation, his body cutting through the chaos like water flowing around stones. The 3 attackers never saw him coming. In the span of heartbeats, their coordinated assault became a symphony of broken bones and unconscious bodies hitting the floor. When the lights finally came back on, Warden Collins stood unharmed, while the would-be assassins lay motionless at Marcus's feet. The Brotherhood's final gambit had failed spectacularly. Nakamura's desperate attempt to eliminate both the Warden and Marcus in one coordinated strike had only proven what everyone now understood. The old hierarchy was dead. The Rising Sun Brotherhood's reign of terror had ended not with negotiations or transfers, but with the quiet competence of a man who had never wanted to fight in the first place. Marcus served the remainder of his sentence without incident. The Brotherhood dissolved within weeks, its members either transferring to other facilities or finding new ways to survive in a prison where respect was no longer earned through intimidation. Other inmates began approaching Marcus not for protection, but for guidance. He started teaching meditation classes in the library, showing younger prisoners that strength came from discipline, not violence. When his release day finally arrived, Marcus walked through those steel doors with the same calm dignity he had carried since his first day at Eastwood. Behind him, he left a changed place where bullies no longer ruled through fear, where the strongest man was the one who chose not to fight until he absolutely had to. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks the least threatening, and sometimes it takes just one man refusing to kneel to remind everyone that true power flows from inner peace, not clenched fists. That's a lesson that echoed through every cell block long after Marcus Williams returned to the free world.